Have you ever carried a grudge so long that it started to live inside your accent? That winter in Aarhus, Denmark, I realized my English wasn't the only thing frozen. My heart was too. I kept repeating words perfectly but couldn't say what really mattered. This video isn't about grammar or pronunciation. It's about how learning to forgive helped me finally speak. Maybe you're not bad at English. Maybe you just haven't melted yet. A winter without warmth. Aarhus in winter feels like a quiet movie set. Streets covered in soft snow. Bicycles parked like frozen memories. And a sky that refuses to smile. I remember walking home from class one evening, my scarf covering half my face, wondering why everything felt so cold. Not just the weather but me. I wasn't sad because of anyone else. I was sad because I didn't know how to let go. You know that kind of silence that follows you even when you're in a crowd? That was my English then. I could pronounce words, pass grammar tests, even read novels. But when someone looked me in the eyes and asked, "How are you really doing?" my mouth froze. It wasn't the language that failed me. It was fear of being seen, of sounding broken, of saying the wrong thing and losing face. Every day I watched snowflakes fall outside my window. They landed, melted, disappeared, over and over. And I thought, if snow can let go so easily, why can't I? Maybe forgiveness is like that. Not a one-time decision, but 1,000 tiny meltings. That winter, I began to see learning English and learning forgiveness as the same journey. Both require patience. Both ask you to start again after every mistake. And both somehow lead you back to yourself. I used to think fluency meant speaking perfectly. Now I think it means speaking honestly, even when your voice shakes, even when your grammar does too. Because sometimes healing sounds like broken English whispered into cold air and Aarhus. The snow fell quietly, but inside me something started to thaw. When English felt like ice. Learning English in Denmark was supposed to be easy. Everyone here speaks it so well that even the old man selling flowers near my apartment sounds like a BBC host. But somehow, the more I listened, the smaller I felt. Every word I tried to say came out like stepping on thin ice. Careful cracking, afraid to fall through. You probably know that feeling too, when your brain knows the words, but your tongue hesitates like it's translating your shame, not your thoughts. I remember standing in front of my classmates during a presentation. My slides were ready, my ideas were solid, but my mouth betrayed me. Words came out stiff, mechanical, like I was reading someone else's diary. Afterward, my teacher smiled kindly and said, "Don't worry, it takes time." But I wasn't worried about time. I was worried that maybe my English would always sound like winter, cold and distant. One night, I recorded myself reading a story out loud. My voice sounded strange, too slow, too careful. I laughed at first, then cried. I realized I wasn't practicing to communicate. I was practicing to hide. Every sentence was like building a snow wall between me and the world. Science says fear activates the amygdala, the part of your brain that keeps you safe from danger. But your brain doesn't know the difference between a tiger and a conversation. It only feels the threat. That's why your heart races, your palms sweat, and your accent thickens when you speak. Your body is not failing. It's protecting you. And yet, protection can also become a prison. I learned that the hard way. The more I tried to sound perfect, the less I sounded like me. One evening, as I walked home under a streetlight glowing through the snow, I whispered in English, "I'm tired of being careful." The words came out warm. Maybe that was the first time English didn't feel like ice. It felt like a tiny fire starting inside me. The Silent Café. There's a small cafe near the harbor in Aarhus where time seems to move slower than anywhere else. The walls are pale yellow, the coffee smells like toasted almonds, and there's always a soft hum of quiet conversations in English, Danish, and something in between. I used to sit there every Saturday hiding behind my laptop pretending to study, but really I was studying people that I watched how Danes spoke English. Their grammar wasn't perfect. Their pronunciation sometimes slipped into a Danish melody. But they didn't seem to care. They laughed mid-sentence, paused when they forgot a word, and just kept going. There was no panic in their eyes, no apology on their lips. That's when it hit me. They speak like they belong. And maybe that's what I was missing. Not vocabulary, not accent, but belonging. One morning, I overheard a young couple beside me. The girl said, "Your English is funny." The boy grinned and replied, "Good. Then you'll remember it." I almost laughed into my cup. That confidence, playful, light, human, was the opposite of how I treated my own English. I had turned it into a battlefield, where every mistake was a wound. Psychologists call this linguistic perfectionism. It's when your brain links your worth to how correctly you speak. The problem? It makes you forget why you started learning in the first place. Not to sound flawless, but to connect. That day I closed my laptop, ordered another latte, and decided to speak, even if it came out messy. When the barista asked, "How's your day?" I answered, "Better," since I stopped hiding from it. She smiled. We talked for 2 minutes. My grammar fell apart twice. My heart 3 times. But I felt alive that I walked home with cold hands and a warm chest. Sometimes the real lesson doesn't come from a classroom. It comes from a coffee cup and a stranger who reminds you that language isn't about being right. It's about being real. The voice inside my head. If you've ever tried to speak another language, you know that the hardest conversations don't happen with other people. They happen inside your own head. Mine was loud, sarcastic, and mean. Every time I opened my mouth, that voice whispered, "You sound stupid. Your accent is weird. They're judging you." It was like carrying a tiny bully in my brain, fluent in every insecurity I had. That voice didn't come from nowhere. It grew from years of trying to be good enough. In school, in relationships, even in learning English. I used to think the goal was to erase my mistakes. But the truth is, every accent, every hesitation, every tells a story. I just didn't want to listen to mine. There's a theory in psychology called self-referential looping. It means your brain repeats negative thoughts until they become your identity. When I kept thinking, "I'm bad at speaking English," my brain started collecting proof. Every awkward pause, every blank stare from someone, every word I forgot, all became evidence that I wasn't good enough. It was exhausting. Then one evening I decided to answer that voice out loud. I looked in the mirror and said, Yes, I make mistakes. But I'm learning. My reflection didn't argue. For the first time, silence felt kind. When I started talking to myself in English, not practicing, just talking, something shifted. My brain stopped labeling mistakes as failures and started labeling them as progress. Slowly, the voice in my head changed tone. From "you'll never get it right" to "hey, that wasn't too bad." And here's what's funny. When the voice in your head becomes gentler, your spoken English does too. Your words flow easier because they're no longer fighting for permission to exist. Maybe that's what fluency really means, not perfect grammar but inner peace. Because the moment your inner voice becomes your friend, every sentence you speak becomes a small act of courage. Letters I never sent. It started as a writing exercise. My teacher once said, "If you want to think in English, write in English, not perfectly but personally." So I began writing letters. Not emails, not essays, but real emotional letters to people I could never send them to. The first one was to someone I used to love. I wrote about how angry I was, how betrayed I felt, how tired I was of pretending I was fine. My grammar broke in 10 different places, my tenses collided, and my vocabulary sometimes ran away mid-sentence. But for the first time, my English felt alive. It wasn't a school subject anymore, it was my voice finding its way through the snow. You see, language isn't just about communication. It's also about confession. Psychologists call this expressive writing therapy. When you put your feelings into words, any words, your brain starts organizing chaos into meaning. Writing, even in a second language, gives pain a structure. It turns noise into narrative. Each letter became a mirror. One to my parents, one to my younger self, one to the version of me who was still waiting for an apology that would never come. And as I wrote, I realized I didn't need their answers. I just needed to hear mine, that I never sent those letters. They stayed in a folder called drafts. Like silent proof that healing doesn't always need an audience. But each time I wrote, my English grew a little more natural. Not because I learned new words, but because I learned honesty. The day I wrote, "I forgive you," I stopped halfway and cried. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. I wasn't forgiving him. I was forgiving myself for holding on too long, for punishing myself with silence, for thinking I had to be perfect before I could speak. So maybe, in the end, those letters weren't about them at all. They were about learning a new kind of fluency. The ability to be soft in a language that once scared me. Forgiveness sounds like freedom. Forgiveness doesn't sound like what you think. It doesn't come with background music or a cinematic sigh of relief. It sounds more like breathing. Quiet. Awkward. Human. The same way learning English sometimes feels, halting, unsure, and yet moving forward anyway. That winter in Aarhus, I began to notice something strange. The more I practiced English, the more I started forgiving. Not just people, but moments, memories, versions of myself I'd outgrown. Every time I stumbled over a word, I laughed instead of cringing. Every time someone corrected me, I thanked them instead of hiding. It was subtle but powerful, like ice melting under sunlight you didn't realize was already there. Science says forgiveness lowers your cortisol levels, the stress hormone that makes your chest tight and your sleep restless. It literally softens your brain's response to pain. That's why when you let go, your body feels lighter, your breath deeper. And the same thing happens when you stop fighting your mistakes in English. Your brain, once tense and guarded, starts to trust again. One day, I was practicing pronunciation and suddenly burst out laughing. I've been saying comfort zone wrong for years. But instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt free. Because what mattered wasn't getting it right. It was daring to say it out loud. That's when I realized something big. Forgiveness and language learning are twin teachers. Both ask the same questions. Will you try again even after failing? Will you be gentle with yourself this time? Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about reclaiming your peace. And language isn't about impressing others. It's about expressing you. That winter my English became less perfect but more alive. My heart followed. Maybe freedom doesn't come when we finally master a language, or even when we finally forgive someone. Maybe it begins the moment we decide to stop punishing ourselves for being human. Speaking to the snow. It was one of those Danish nights when the world felt completely silent. No cars, no footsteps. Just the sound of snow falling like slow applause from the sky. I walked down the empty street, scarf wrapped high, heart wide open. I didn't bring music or friends. Just me. And my voice. I started speaking in English, softly at first, like testing the air. "Hi, it's me again," I said to no one, my breath visible in the cold. The words hung there, fragile but real. Then I kept going, talking about my day, my memories, my fears, my dreams. I didn't care about grammar or accent anymore. I just wanted to hear myself exist. There's something magical about talking to the snow. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't judge. It listens, then disappears quietly like the best kind of audience. And that night as I spoke, I realized how far I'd come. Months ago, I couldn't say a single sentence without doubting it. Now I was telling stories to the wind. Linguists say speaking out loud helps the brain form muscle memory for language. But I think it also trains something deeper, emotional memory. Each time I spoke in English, I was practicing forgiveness, self-acceptance, and courage in real time. My tongue was no longer afraid of slipping. It was learning to dance. At one point, I looked up and whispered, "I forgive you." I didn't mean a person. I meant myself, the one who once quit every time it got hard, who believed her voice didn't deserve to be heard. The snow fell harder. My cheeks stung, but my chest felt light. My English was still imperfect. But that night it didn't matter. Because I wasn't talking to learn. I was talking to feel. And somewhere between my breath and the falling snow, I heard something new, not an echo but an answer. It was peace finally speaking back. The language of peace. By spring, the snow in Aarhus had melted, but something inside me stayed quiet. Not the silence of loneliness, but the calm that comes after a storm. I walked the same streets where I once felt invisible, and suddenly they felt familiar, like pages of a book I had already learned to read. When people spoke to me in English now, I didn't panic. I listened, smiled, and answered, not perfectly but truthfully. My voice had changed. It wasn't louder, it was lighter. It carried something new. peace, I realized that every mistake, every awkward pause, every mispronounced word had been teaching me the same lesson. That communication is never about perfection. It's about connection. You don't need flawless grammar to say, I understand you. You don't need native pronunciation to say, I care. That winter taught me something I never learned in class. Forgiveness and fluency speak the same language, the language of self-kindness. When you stop fighting your flaws, you start learning faster, loving deeper, and living easier. So if you're still struggling with English, with forgiveness, or with yourself, maybe stop asking, when will I be good enough? And start whispering, what if I already am? Every time you speak, even imperfectly, you prove that courage still lives inside you. Every time you forgive, you make space for freedom to move in. And maybe, just maybe, fluency isn't a sound. It's a feeling, the moment your heart and your voice finally speak the same truth. So this is what peace sounds like. Slow, simple, honest, like English spoken with love.